So just a quick introduction for those. I'm sure you know most of these people. Right here to my right is Joan Sullivan. Of course, she came to a lot of people's attention maybe 15 years ago, so here in New York when she started the Bronx Academy of Letters. And of course, now she is the CEO of the Partnership of LA Schools, as we've been talking about. And to her right, of course, is John White, who is the superintendent of the Louisiana State Education Department. And to his right is Don Bossi, who runs FIRST, which is, of course, a nonprofit organization that focuses pretty heavily on STEM and promoting STEM for children, getting them involved, robotics and other sort of science and math activities that are really just going to develop them, not only in terms of developing careers, but just really develop their brains to help them think a little bit more about how they can improve. And then all the way down there to the right, not to be forgotten, is Brandon Steiner. He's the founder, CEO of Steiner Sports. And a big part of his approach, of course, is through entrepreneurship and really teaching kids about business and how to develop themselves as business people and as entrepreneurs. So I want to get started, and I'm going to start with you, Joan, because you have taken on two pretty big challenges. You started a fairly small school here in New York several years ago, and then you've sort of expanded that idea out to LA. And I wonder, is there a way to take sort of that small approach where you're dealing with one school here in New York or 18 schools in LA? Is there a way to take that idea and expand it to a full statewide school system or a full nationwide school system?
Well, hi.
Hi, I'm well.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I guess as I think about it, the partnership is a model in the sense that in the public education sector, we have plenty of people who are willing to criticize districts, to find fault with the system in a million different ways, how enrollment is done, the funding formulas. But there are very few entities that are willing to take responsibility for schools, to be accountable, and to do the work alongside districts. And I think there are many people in the room that are doing that work, but it's not pretty always, and it's not perfect. But the only way for us to address the systemic inequities that live within large urban school systems is if organizations and individuals are willing to step up and do the work on the inside of running schools and being accountable for results. And so the partnership holds a unique position in that we live in the system so that we have visibility into the challenges district schools face. We have an incentive to tackle those challenges, and we have relationships that allow us to scale change that benefits the larger student population.
But you characterize your organization as being within the system.
Yeah.
There has been some criticism that the way that it's set up, it's sort of system adjacent. How do you respond to that?
Well, I believe if we remove ourselves from the system, then we're not positioned to affect change at scale. And so I think we have to do this inside-out game. And I think there is a false choice that we're making. We're sort of saying we're a traditional district, or we're going to go down a charter path. And I do think there is an alternative, which is to leverage philanthropic dollars, to leverage external resources, and put them working in the system to show what's possible for schools that are persistently low performing and that are driving a lot of the achievement gaps.
So, John, you are the system to a certain degree as the head of the Louisiana school system. And when you took over some years back, you put out some pretty strong initiatives to try to improve not only the academic standards for the kids, but also the standards for teachers and everything else. And that was met with some controversy. Now, you look back 7 years or so ago when you started that. Do you think that the way that you approached it was not necessarily the right way, but do you think that it paid the dividends that you were seeking at the time?
Well, yes and no. And I mean, I think to what Joan said, I completely believe that if there's evidence that something works, it can be scaled. And the reason I believe that is that there's countries around the world that are doing that regularly. I think we face unique challenges both in our state and in our country. If they're not unique, they're at least significant in the United States. Those are significance of our inequities, some of which are attributable to structural factors, the role of teachers in our society and the anti-intellectualism that I think pervades a lot of our country, and probably worst of all, the incredibly fragmented structure of our system. That all said, I've seen every bit of evidence that good, sensible, evidence-based policy, if you work at it day after day, if you create a coherent structure within which teachers and principals can do their job, has an effect. And by the way, I think you're sitting in a city where for 12 years the administration did just that. And is the system in New York perfect? Absolutely not. But was it better when the mayor left it? Yes, absolutely. And that's evidence that at great scale, the nation's largest system, a system with tremendously challenging politics and structural issues, you can affect change at great scale.
When we talk about the change and really getting the results, we talk a lot about graduation rates. And I want to bring Don into this conversation here because a lot of what you do is, I guess, outside of the system to a certain degree, intentionally so. And I wonder that how do we talk about more than just the graduation rates and the idea that when those kids graduate, that they really have the skills to really prosper in whatever they choose to do, because that's not always the case.
So I would describe us as system adjacent. I liked your term
Okay,
earlier.
all right. Everyone gets to pick their own.
Yeah, I get to pick my own term. So for those of you that don't know first, we're sort of, most people know us as the after-school robotics competitions, all the way from ages 6 through 18. So largely we live in the after-school space, but 2/3 of our teams actually meet at schools. So we're part of the school culture, although not necessarily part of the traditional school day or the classroom. And that's actually a really fun and interesting space, I think, because in our space, like and I also say we don't describe ourselves as an education organization, we're an inspiration organization. So our goal is to inspire young people to become the next generation of leaders and innovators. But I personally believe inspiration is the predecessor of education. When a kid is inspired, when they're turned on, they're much more open to learning. And so we see kids immediately who participate in our program, suddenly the light goes on. I mean, I'll do my usual. How many people in this room remember sitting in a math or science class at some point in your life saying, when will I ever use this? Be honest, right? And so we try to, if you put the inspiration, if you give them a challenge that they actually want to solve and that they're engaged in, then the learning comes naturally. And that's actually what's really fun about our role, is we're starting to see that by being system adjacent but somewhat intertwined, that the teachers who coach and mentor our teams start to bring that type of process into their classroom, into their day job. And so we're trying to affect change from sort of within.
So Brandon, jump in here. I mean, you're an entrepreneur. You're from Brooklyn, back when people were still afraid of Brooklyn. So I guess that gives you a little bit.
And that's a degree. That's a degree in itself.
What is it that you're trying to get across to kids, and really how are you integrating yourself into this?
I think it's about faith. I grew up and I was such an odd kid. I mean, nobody knew what to do with me because I was hustling, dreaming, scheming, figuring out every which way to make money, and people they didn't really know what to do with me. And obviously I felt a little awkward in school. I didn't really find there was a place. I'm just fortunate I had a mom that sold me in on, hanging in education, and that in the long run this would help me. But I think what I'm seeing, I have a platform that I use for a lot of young kids and entrepreneurs to talk about what's next. And I'm just seeing a lack of faith with kids that don't trust the system, that they're going to adhere to what they want to do. And particularly entrepreneurs. And we have kids now that, I haven't seen a group of kids now that are this bright, can do this much, and have so many awkward ideas, and they're not willing to stay status quo, and nobody's responding to that, so they feel like they've got to go out on their own and do it. And my fear for them, which you really can't have fear and faith at the same time, that's troublesome, is that they're not ready. They don't understand the back end of how to go put these incredible ideas into play. So my goal is to try to keep these kids in and talk them into staying in and why, and explain to them why. What would be nice is if we can make some adjustments in the classroom a little bit and get away from some of the traditional learning, which I'm not going to sit here and get into that debate, but what I would say is it would be nice to have some really more pure entrepreneurism taught in the classroom, not just from a business standpoint, because there's some great entrepreneurs on this stage, teachers, politicians, education, media, and we need to bring entrepreneurism throughout the entire school, because just on one final note, you have 750,000 small businesses closing. every year and only 600,000 a year opening. And you do the math, and at some point, those are the, I always say the riches are in the niches. Like, you have to promote that you can have a dream. It doesn't have to be to open up the next Amazon. It could just be the corner store in your town. So we've got to promote that, and in order to do that, we've got to teach some untraditional courses and some untraditional ways to do that.
All right, I want to move away from the children for 1 second, because one of the big stressors that we have in our school systems nationwide really boils down to teachers, getting good teachers, not only getting them into the school, but really retaining them and keeping them there. So I'll start on this side of the couch here, because I want to know, what is the selling point these days that you make to teachers, or potential teachers, I should say, who may be a little bit reticent about coming into an environment that is fraught with politics, coming into an environment that's not necessarily going to be the most lucrative on a pay scale. What is the selling point that you make to them?
Well, I mean, we often hear that public education is the civil rights issue of our time, and I think we don't pause long enough to absorb what that really means. And to me, it means that that if history has taught us anything, it's that when we come together and challenge big entrenched institutions, we can change them. We can bring an end to slavery. We can extend the right to vote to women. We can extend the right to marry to people like me, our gay brothers and sisters. And that and in public education, we can make access to a quality education is our civil right, and it is our patriotic duty. And that is what I would say to teachers, because it is inspiration that I think our teachers need. That's in the grand sense, right? Public education is, those are our soldiers. This is our most important battle. But more practically, I think you have to invest in school leaders, because the school really is the unit within the system that matters most. And if we're not putting great leaders at the helm in schools, teachers are going to leave. And we don't invest nearly enough systemically in leadership, not in terms of the salaries we pay our leaders, but also not in terms of the professional development, supports, autonomies, and that they need to thrive. And that, to me, is a really powerful miscalculation, but it's also a powerful opportunity, and it is what it takes to attract and retain great teachers. Well,
this seems to have come to a head a little bit. I mean, last year we saw several teacher strikes or walkouts in at least 9 different states, maybe more than that. And there was obviously a lot of talk about, the pay raises and things like that, but it really went beyond pay. There were a lot of concerns, John, that were addressed, that were sort of asked with regards to the hours that they work, or the way that they were being assessed in terms of their performance. When you talk to teachers in your school, in your state, and you get a sense from them as to what their potential complaints might be with regards to how the system is treating them or how they perceive it to be, how do you address that? How do you talk to them and say, we have your best interests in mind, and this is going to work out for all of us?
Yeah. Well, let's first, just because the strikes are on the table, let's just talk quickly about the strikes.
Absolutely.
There are reasons legitimate and there are reasons illegitimate for why those strikes took place. And I think the voice of the teacher unions that made the decision to strike is a very different voice from the voice of the average teacher. Now, I think we can do 3 things that can help get our profession back to a more sustainable place. And look, there are people in the audience like Bill Haidt from Philadelphia who are here every day trying to fight this very fight, which is in the tightest labor market in 2 generations. How do you convince a group of college-educated people to do what Joan said, and that is to be heroes for a group of kids? And how do you do it in particular in a place like Philadelphia that has legions and legions of low-income kids concentrated in certain school buildings? Well, I think there's 3 things we can do. The first is the easy one, but for some reason it's never done. And that is actually get to a point where, when you're a teacher, you're trained in the classroom for at least a year alongside a veteran before you ever step in. You have a curriculum that teaches what the standards say. You have a test that actually measures what's in the curriculum, and you're evaluated fairly based on your ability to implement a system that makes some sense. We could do that, but virtually no districts and no states in the country actually line those things up. Second, the compensation system is so far from, in our profession, so far from what exists in a company like Bloomberg LLP or anywhere else, it's obscene. We have a back-end pension-based system. We intentionally don't front-load compensation for the people we're trying to bring into our profession, and we can change that. And third, and this gets a little bit to some of the points that were made, we actually do have to think differently about the profession. Every job in the world is moving toward a greater state of specialization, a greater stage of flexibility, except ours, where we ask teachers to be social workers, knowledge experts, teachers of reading, teachers of problem solving, all these things at once. Even though, you know, my background, I'm an English major, certified as an English teacher. I'm not going to be able to do all that really, truly effectively. We have to think differently about our school organizations.
All right. So when we talk about the school organizations, and you know, I want to go to you, Brandon, for a second here, because with your background in entrepreneurship, one of the good things about entrepreneurship, it does provide an avenue for kids who maybe don't necessarily want to go to college or go straight to college or go through the traditional avenues that maybe a lot of us took with college and grad school. Is that a pathway, do you think, that given where society is now, where a kid who graduates from high school can make a career on their own without necessarily going through a formal education at the collegiate level?
I mean, I'm not a fan of it. I mean, I discourage it because I think there's a growing up process. There's a, you know, I always say it's so important to understand people. And you get so many intangible things when you go to higher education. You know, it doesn't come up in a grade. You know, me, and I go and speak at a lot of schools, and you know, I give all my kids all the answers to all the tests the first day of class, and then get on with how we're going to figure out the answers and how we got to the answers, instead of trying to trick kids, instead of trying to, I always felt like I was in classes and I was just trying to get tricked. You know, it all wasn't making sense to me. You know, maybe it was the ADHD, the OCD, the high levels that I was experiencing, you know, watching that, you know, I'm not going to ever get out of this classroom. But also being inspired about stuff that was interesting to me. I think like more competition. When you see the talent with some of the kids, like I run into classrooms and, you know, they hear an entrepreneur. It's easy for Steiner Sports. It's a company that kids can get their arms around. Most kids will come up to me and they'll say, like, it's really not that complicated what you do. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, it's pretty, but there are some skills you're gonna need in order to go put that into play. And, you know, and since, you know, we're selling sports, signed baseballs, or, you know, booking athletes for appearances, like kids can relate to that. So it's easy for them to get their arms around it. And then I can go get in for the kill, which is, well, you know, you need to have, you know, you need to hire people, you need to make out checks, you need to, you know, learn how to borrow money, you need to put a strategy together. You can't just wing it. And that kind of lures the kids back in. So, you know, to answer your question, I think it's really, really important that we stop tricking our kids, and we're actually just fooling ourselves that, you know, that these SATs and ACTs and even grade point averages. I went to a high school, it was pass-fail. No grades. I had 760 my boards, that's just between us, combined. And when I went home and asked my mother how much money we had to put towards the education, she said, absolutely 100% zero. Yeah. And, you know, I went to the most expensive private school in New York State. And I managed to fare well. You know, I had a grind. It wasn't a cakewalk, as it was like for my wife, who I'm not sure she ever sweated with a 4.0, but at Penn, you know. But at the end of the day, I was studying. When we got married, we combined our books. I'm like, whoa, I had the same book, my same economics book, same accounting book. So I think, like, to me, the faster we get away from some of that traditional stuff, we can really see the real talent in the kids. And I think the grading and all these tests and stuff cloud the issue of, you know, getting some of the smarter kids to where they need to be. So,
John, what do you think about that? Because I've noticed this has been a trend. My child's at a pass-fail school, essentially, and it was kind of foreign to me. I grew up in a traditional system where you had the standardized tests. But it does seem to be a trend now where we're trying to find different ways to grade or assess how our children are doing in school beyond just those normal metrics. Is that something that's really viable?
Yeah, and I think Brandon makes some good points. I mean, yeah. I think that our system today does have the potential for having a lot of kids guessing rather than actually us accurately capture everything that they've learned. However, we have to get back to something that Joan said earlier, which is that this is a country that has delegated the responsibility for educating its kids to 14,000 organizations called school boards, political organizations called school boards. This is a country that for hundreds of years subjugated a huge percentage of its population to enslavement, bigotry, and bias, still does. And so if you're to ensure the civil rights of people in rural Louisiana, half of whose school systems are still under federal consent decrees to ensure racial integration, for example, then you do have to have some way across tens of millions of kids of validating that actually learning happened. So do I think that the standardized tests, do I think everything about the ACT in my state is a great test? Absolutely not. If I could change it today, I'd change it in a million different ways. But what I can't have is a way of looking at poor kids and rich kids, is a way of looking at kids in the Ninth Ward of New Orleans and kids in Uptown New Orleans, and not being able to verify that on some level, the kid in the Ninth Ward is being given everything that the kid in the Uptown is.
Yeah. So Don, when we talk about a lot of the underprivileged kids, you know, a lot of times we talk about exposing them to different things. That's sort of a way of sort of making kids just aware that there's a better life out there. Yep. Because a lot of them do kind of live and just operate every day in a very sheltered world. Your program kind of attempts to do that, right? And I wonder that when you look at the changes in our labor market right now, that is definitely much more weighted to science or science types of skill sets that didn't exist even a decade ago. What's your approach specifically to those kids and trying to get them prepared for the world?
So to your point, equity, diversity, and inclusion is really important to us. And in fact, what we see is when we reach kids, our programs, there's a definite benefit. But when we reach the kids who are least likely to have access to our programs, the benefit's even bigger. It's really game-changing because it opens their eyes to opportunities that they didn't know exist. So a big part of what we do, and a big part of the way we do that, is actually bringing sort of, I don't want to call it corporate America, but corporate partnerships into schools. So our teams are typically coached by a teacher, but also mentors from industry, like companies like Bloomberg. But also, it can be small companies. It can be the little auto shop in a small town. So we try to bring people from the workforce, I guess is the right way to say it, in to work with these kids. And it's about opening their eyes to the opportunity, which sometimes they don't realize even exists. And so it's creating that opportunity. And I really do think, again, it's that sort of industry school partnership. I mean, a lot of teachers have never worked in industry, so they don't even know necessarily all the skills that are needed. And it's not all just knowing math facts or, you know, how to write things well, but how do you work on a team? How do you collaborate? You know, how do you lead? How do you follow? How do you think creatively and entrepreneurially? So it's pretty neat when you can get sort of all aspects of the community together working with kids, and it really opens their eyes and is game changing.
All right. Joan, I want to talk a little bit about just this sort of movement that we've seen in a lot of cities now with regards to charter schools. I mean, this was a very popular idea for a while. We've seen recently it's kind of fallen a little bit out of favor in terms of the public perception of it, but we're also seeing kind of an uptick in public perception with regards to school vouchers and some of these sort of alternative means of funding and education or steering kids into a better education. Do you think that the school, specifically with regards to the charter school movement that we've seen, do you think that's something, as it stands now, is transparent enough and is successful enough that it should sort of remain intact?
Well, I guess what I'd say is that we are not, so I think it's a complicated issue. And one thing that I do think it's important to understand is that those of us who have means are exercising some degree of choice all the time. Right. We're moving to a different community. We are advocating to get our child into a magnet system. We are sending our kids to parochial private schools. And so despite what I believe are a lot of challenges with the district and charter dichotomy and some of the points of intersection that are problematic around enrollment, and there's concentration of need in district schools as a result of the growth of charters, for example, and that is problematic. On the flip side, I don't think that it is okay for us to be depriving families of choices when they would otherwise be stuck in chronically failing schools. And so I think it's a complicated issue, and the challenge our district faces is trying to figure out how to bridge some of these divides so that we can think more holistically, for example, about enrollment systems and distribute students more thoughtfully across both systems.
Are we at risk, though, with the charter school system, school vouchers, and all these sort of alternative measures? Are we at risk of just creating a different set of inequities through this?
Well, I do think that there are a couple of things that are the most important elements of success. It's always surprising to me that in education people are so strident when we don't have results. So if we had a better clear view of the path forward, we'd have better results. So I try not to be too strident, but I do think there are a couple of common elements that are going to be in place wherever you see success. And one of them is continuity of effort, which John spoke to, and which New York had sort of uniquely with a 3-term mayor. And continuity of effort is absolutely vital. And what we more often see is a parade of superintendents, and it's why I chose to do what I do, is because as this sort of third way where we're operating district schools, we can be continuity for the district. We can be a through line on vital issues. But to your point around equity, I view another part of the challenge as really needing to implement radical equity. And I don't know how that plays into your charter question, but I think more broadly, when we are approaching change within districts, we cannot be mildly differentiating our approaches across schools. We need to be radically differentiating, because you can see it right now. Stuyvesant has 8 students who are black out of 1,000 students, right? So we need to be doing something dramatically differently from school to school in a district that is high needs, right? And the schools at the bottom 5%. And then the other point that I would make that I think speaks to the robotics angle is that we need to approach the student holistically. And so that does involve bringing in a range of resources to schools. So that's not a direct answer to your question, but I think equity is an issue, but it's a far bigger issue than is created by charters alone. And I think we think much too evenly about how to serve schools and not nearly as deeply as we need to about how we need to differentiate in dramatic ways from campus to campus according to the needs of the students.
John, the way schools are funded right now, public schools are funded, do you think that's still a viable way to fund schools? I'm talking about the traditional way of funding schools on a district-by-district basis.
Well, I think there's a million things that are problematic about how we fund schools, and I think it is state to state and community to community, and you literally would have to go 50 states, every single district, to unpack all of the problems that exist. You'd have to look at the retirement laws. You'd have to look at the healthcare systems. I mean, it is a mess. And the one thing I would say about it is the reform community has been remiss in not addressing it in a more head-on manner. It should be looked at more seriously. One thing on enrollment, just very quickly, we're sitting in a school zone right now. It's a school zone whose residents are primarily people who earn 6 and 7 figures. And you have to ask yourself, if you are so disturbed by, if one is so disturbed by the ostensible inequities that are created by charter schools or other choice options, why is it not just as troubling that the government has drawn lines around zones of wildly wealthy people to which only those people's children are able to enroll in school? The original sin of enrollment policies was set by the traditional system that in cities that redlined neighborhoods around lines of poverty and wealth, enfranchised those lines by bringing them into the public school system. And charter schools should not be blamed for that issue. Could charter schools be managed better? Absolutely. But I would challenge the school boards who oversee those enrollment policies, policies that screen kids when they're 5 years old as to whether or not they are academically gifted, and then put them into pockets of wealth. Those policies need to be examined too if we're really talking about equity and enrollment.
That's right.
Brandon, what's the main thing you would want to see changed with our current school system?
Oh boy. I'm not a fan of the private schools. You know, I'm just not. I mean, it's immediate. I'm not a fan of segregation of it all. I mean, to me, I think it was a distinct advantage, you know, to be in a room full of Spanish, all different colors of people. I don't know what to do with who first, and go home with these kids and see how they were living. I think it's a huge advantage, and I feel bad that my kid didn't have that advantage. You know, going to a pretty much all white school, and you know, maybe there was a couple Asian kids in there. I mean, I think it's a disadvantage. So, you know, I think we got to take down the fences and take down the barriers quickly. And I think when you take the wealth out of the public schools, this is exactly what you're doing. You know, they're going to private schools, and then the wealth isn't as concerned with it. And before the panel before, where we talked about, should billionaires be able to, donate and put money in? And I think it is a deterrent, because it kind of sends a message that we're all deferring unless have that kind of wealth. We're deferring to them to fix the problem, when the problem is all of ours. So I know I can't fix the problem. I'll go fix a library. I'll go in and fix a program, put a STEM program in, and donate maybe $50,000. I know that doesn't cure it all, but if everybody took that approach. But I think most people are leaning towards the billionaires to fix the problem, when the problem is all of ours. And I think all of us are better than some of us. And we should all get back together again and do that, not separate and try to get a leg up, right from 5 years old and up. And I always felt like the kids in the neighborhood that went to the private school right out of the gate, that was already a message to me that maybe I was inferior to them, or that I wasn't as smart as them, when that just wasn't true. As I still run into those kids now, and they're sitting up in the nosebleed seats. And when I'm sitting all the way down in the first row, I'm like, hey, what's up? How's that private school? Good? But
all right, well, Brandon, you get the last word, the last laugh, too, I guess. I want to thank Brandon, Steiner, Don Bossi, John White, and, of course, Joan Sullivan from Partnership for LA Schools. Give them a big round of applause.